Standing in our bedroom, my bedroom now, I opened the closet to find his side completely empty, except for one old sweater he'd apparently deemed unworthy of his new existence. The hangers hung there like skeletons, and I found myself running my fingers along the empty rod where his shirts used to hang, trying to remember if I'd ever really looked at them, if I'd ever paid attention to the way he organized his clothes, or which shirts he'd loved most. The absence was everywhere, but so was the presence of things he'd chosen to leave behind, and somehow that felt worse. The sweater that wasn't good enough for his new life, the books he'd decided he could live without, the coffee mug with the chip on the handle that I'd always meant to throw away but somehow never did. These felt like judgment calls, like he'd sorted through our entire shared existence and decided what was worth keeping and what wasn't, and apparently I fell into the second category. What I didn't know was that losing everything would teach me what couldn't be lost. But the cruelest thing he'd taken wasn't any object. It was my peace of mind, my ability to trust my own perceptions, my confidence that I knew how to read the signs of love and commitment. For months, maybe years, I'd been living with a man who was already gone, going through the motions of our marriage while planning his escape, and I'd been too trusting or too naive or too desperate to notice that I was married to a ghost. There hadn't been a fight. That might have been the worst part. If there had been screaming, if there had been accusations thrown like grenades across our living room, if there had been the kind of dramatic confrontation that ends marriages in movies, at least I would have seen it coming. At least I would have had the dignity of knowing our relationship was in trouble instead of discovering its death certificate on my kitchen table next to the sugar bowl in yesterday's mail. The note was typed, not handwritten, printed on the same computer paper he used for work documents. Even his goodbye was generic, professional, the kind of language you'd use to resign from a job you didn't want to burn bridges with. Sarah, it began, not Dear Sarah or My Love or any of the endearments that had punctuated 7 years of marriage. Just my name, flat and formal as a court document. I've decided that our marriage isn't working for me anymore. I've taken what I need and left the rest. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce proceedings. I think it's better if we don't communicate directly during this process. I hope you understand. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that we'd built a life together, that we'd promised each other forever, that I'd spent 7 years believing I was loved by someone who apparently saw me as a business arrangement that was no longer profitable. The cowardice of leaving without explanation, without conversation, without giving me the chance to fight for us or at least understand what I'd lost, felt like a violence all its own. He'd stolen my right to closure, my opportunity to have the kind of ending that made sense, that provided some roadmap for how to move forward from the wreckage. I read the note 17 times before the words started to feel real, and even then, they felt like they were happening to someone else, like I was reading about the dissolution of some other woman's marriage, some other woman's life falling apart in neat typed sentences. The worst part was how recent it all was. The coffee cup in the dishwasher meant he'd been here Sunday morning, sitting across from me at breakfast, asking if I wanted the sports section, complaining about his mother's visit next weekend. 48 hours ago, we'd been a married couple with normal married couple problems, whose turn it was to take out the trash, whether we could afford to replace the water heater, when we should start trying for kids. How do you go from discussing which restaurant to try for date night to abandoning someone in less than 3 days? How do you kiss someone goodbye on Sunday evening and disappear from their life by Tuesday morning? What happens in a person's heart that makes love turn into indifference so quickly it leaves skid marks? By Wednesday afternoon, the text messages started. My sister Emma was first. Haven't heard from you in a few days. Everything okay? Then my mother, just calling to check in, sweetie. Call me back when you get this. Then our friends, one by one, with the kind of carefully casual messages that suggested they'd been talking to each other, comparing notes about my sudden absence from group chats and social media, trying to figure out why I'd gone dark without explanation. The problem was that I didn't have an explanation that made sense, even to myself. How do you tell people that your husband evaporated like morning dew? How do you explain that your marriage ended not with a bang but with a typed note and an empty bank account? How do you admit that you were so oblivious to your own life that you didn't see it coming until it was already over? So I didn't respond to any of them. I let their concern pile up in my phone like digital postcards from a world I no longer knew how to inhabit. A world where people had normal problems and expected normal explanations and assumed that major life changes came with advance warning. The shame wasn't just about being abandoned, it was about being stupid enough to be blindsided by abandonment. It was about being the kind of woman who gets left, the kind of wife who doesn't notice her husband checking out, the kind of person whose marriage becomes a cautionary tale at dinner parties. I could already imagine the conversations. Did you hear about Sarah and Mark? He just left one day. No warning, no explanation. She says she had no idea it was coming. I mean, how do you not know your own husband is planning to leave you? The secondary shame was almost worse than the primary trauma. Shame about my shame, embarrassment about being embarrassed, the mortification of becoming someone who needed to be pitied and handled with careful voices and gentle eyes. You, the listener, are asked, have you ever looked around and realized everything familiar was gone? By Thursday, I'd stopped showering. Not as a conscious decision, just as a natural consequence of not having anywhere to go or anyone to see or any reason to pretend I was a person who had herself together. I wandered through the house in the same clothes I'd slept in, opening and closing cabinet doors at random, picking up objects and putting them down without purpose, like I was shopping in my own life, but couldn't find anything I wanted to buy. The silence had changed texture by then. It wasn't just the absence of Mark's sounds anymore. It was the absence of my own sounds, too. I'd stopped talking to myself, stopped humming while I did dishes, stopped making the little unconscious noises that people make when they're comfortable in their own space. Even I had become a stranger in this house, moving through it like a ghost, haunting her own life. Friday morning, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Her hair was tangled and unwashed, hanging limp around a face that looked like it had aged 5 years in 5 days. Her eyes were smaller than they used to be, surrounded by the kind of puffiness that comes from crying at unexpected moments and sleeping at all the wrong times. Her skin had a grayish quality, like she'd been living underground, subsisting on whatever grows in the absence of sunlight. But it was more than just the physical changes. There was something missing from her expression, some essential spark that had been extinguished without my permission. The woman in the mirror looked defeated in a way that went deeper than sadness, broken in a way that seemed permanent, like she'd accepted some terrible verdict about herself that would never be overturned. I touched the mirror with my fingertips, trying to reconcile this stranger with the woman who'd been living in my skin for 32 years. Where was the person who used to laugh easily, who believed in happy endings, who thought she was the kind of woman worth staying married to? When had she been replaced by this hollow-eyed ghost who flinched at her own reflection? Her reflection doesn't look like her anymore, and that was terrifying because if I didn't recognize myself, how could I find my way back to being someone I knew how to be? The woman I used to be had opinions about things, which movies were worth watching, which restaurants served the best pasta, whether we should paint the living room blue or gray. She had preferences and pet peeves and the kind of strong feelings about small things that suggested she believed her life mattered enough to have standards. This woman in the mirror looked like she'd forgotten how to want anything beyond making it through another hour without falling apart completely. That afternoon, sitting on the floor of our walk-in closet because beds felt too hopeful and chairs required too much intention, I began the detailed work of taking responsibility for someone else's cruelty. If I'd been a better cook, maybe he would have wanted to come home for dinner instead of working late so many nights. If I'd been more interesting, maybe our conversations wouldn't have dwindled into discussions about logistics and schedules and who was picking up milk on the way home. If I'd been prettier, maybe he wouldn't have started looking at other women the way I pretended not to notice him looking at other women. If I'd been quieter about my own needs, maybe he wouldn't have felt suffocated by my expectations of partnership and communication and basic human decency. If I'd been more independent, maybe he wouldn't have felt like my happiness was his responsibility. If I'd been more supportive of his career, more understanding about his stress, more willing to shrink myself to make room for his ambitions, maybe he would have seen me as worth keeping instead of worth leaving. The mathematics of self-blame is perfectly logical when you're operating from the premise that love is earned through performance, and that abandonment is always the fault of the abandoned. If he left, it must be because I failed to be someone worth staying for. If our marriage died, it must be because I wasn't enough to keep it alive. But nothing explains his complete emotional withdrawal and silent exit. And somewhere underneath the pile of self-accusations, a tiny voice was beginning to whisper that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't entirely my fault. Maybe a man who could love someone for 7 years and then disappear without explanation wasn't actually capable of love in the first place. Maybe the problem wasn't that I wasn't enough. Maybe the problem was that he was empty, that he'd been performing marriage the same way actors perform roles, convincingly enough to fool the audience, but never really inhabiting the character. Maybe I'd been married to someone who saw me as a supporting player in his life story instead of the co-author of our shared story. And when he decided to write a different ending, he simply erased me from the narrative without considering that I might have my own story to tell. Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after he'd kissed me goodbye like it was any other kiss, I found myself in our closet, my closet now, holding the sweater he'd left behind. It was an old thing, navy blue with a small hole near the left elbow where he'd caught it on a fence while we were hiking last fall. I'd offered to mend it a dozen times, but he'd always said it was fine the way it was, that the hole gave it character. Now I wondered if leaving it behind was one final judgment on our life together. Even his damaged clothes were too good to waste on me. I pressed the sweater to my face and breathed in, trying to catch any lingering scent of the man who'd shared my bed for 7 years, who'd known exactly how I liked my coffee and which movies made me cry and the precise spot on my back that always ached after long days at work. But it just smelled like fabric softener and the faint mustiness of clothes left too long in dark places. That's when I broke down, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the ugly, primal sobbing of someone whose world has been deleted without backup. I sat on the closet floor, clutching his abandoned sweater, and cried with my whole body, the kind of crying that comes from your bones and your blood and every cell that used to believe in permanence. And somewhere in the middle of that breakdown, when I was too tired to edit my thoughts or protect myself from dangerous honesty, I heard myself say the words I'd been avoiding for a week. Why, God? Why did you let me love someone who was always planning to leave? It was the first prayer I'd prayed since finding the note, and it felt like spitting into the wind, futile and likely to hit me in the face. But it was also the first honest thing I'd said out loud since my world collapsed, and honesty, even angry honesty, felt like the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. The words came from somewhere deeper than memory, someplace where my mother's voice still lived, reading me Bible stories before bed when I was small enough to believe that every story had a happy ending and every prayer had a guaranteed answer. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. I wasn't sure I believed it yet. I wasn't sure I wanted to believe it. But sitting on that closet floor, holding the remnants of a life I'd never chosen to leave, those ancient words felt like the only life raft in an ocean that was determined to drown me. Maybe God was still there, even when husbands weren't. Maybe some promises outlasted human promises. Maybe there were things that couldn't be stolen, even by someone who'd helped himself to everything else I thought I owned. I didn't know it yet, but that moment on the closet floor, that first angry prayer, that reluctant whisper of scripture, that tiny crack in the wall I'd built around my heart, was the beginning of discovering what he couldn't take with him when he left. Some treasures, I was about to learn, are theft-proof. My soul is weary with sorrow. Strengthen me according to your word. Psalm 119, verse 28. Grief isn't linear. It's a spiral where each loop teaches you something new about what it means to be human. Monday morning arrived whether I was ready for it or not, bringing with it the cruel expectation that life should continue simply because the calendar said so. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to remember how to be a person who showed up to work, who answered emails, who pretended that the world made sense when everything I'd built my understanding on had been revealed as quicksand. The face looking back at me belonged to someone I was still learning to recognize, a woman whose eyes held the particular emptiness that comes from discovering that the love you thought was bedrock was actually just painted scenery that could be struck and hauled away between acts. I managed to shower, to choose clothes that suggested I was still participating in adult society, to drive the 15 minutes to the elementary school where I taught third grade. But I moved through these familiar routines like someone sleepwalking, my body remembering the choreography of normal life, while my soul remained curled up on that closet floor, clutching a sweater that smelled like abandonment. Pause here if you need a moment. Some stories echo in places we thought we'd healed. Days blur, dishes pile up. She walks aimlessly through stores just to feel human. This became my new normal over the following weeks. Time had become elastic, stretching and contracting without warning. Minutes crawled when I was alone with my thoughts, but entire afternoons disappeared while I stood in Target aisles, not shopping for anything specific, just moving through public spaces where other people were living their unbroken lives. I'd find myself in the grocery store at strange hours, pushing a cart I didn't remember getting, reading ingredient lists on products I'd never buy, listening to the ordinary conversations of couples deciding between regular and whole wheat bread. Their mundane domestic negotiations felt like glimpses into a foreign country I'd once visited, but could no longer find on any map. The dishes in my sink had started to multiply like some sort of ceramic organism that thrived on neglect. I'd use a clean mug for my morning coffee, then leave it sitting wherever I'd finished drinking, as if washing it would be admitting I planned to stick around long enough to drink coffee again tomorrow. The pile grew until I ran out of clean plates. Then I started eating cereal straight from the box, standing over the kitchen sink like a college student who'd never learned how to live like an adult. My apartment, I'd started thinking of it as my apartment now, though the mortgage was still in both our names, had taken on the particular chaos that comes from someone who stopped believing in the future. Mail piled up unopened on the kitchen counter. Clean laundry sat in baskets for so long it started to smell like the fabric softener had given up. I'd buy groceries with good intentions, then watch them slowly rot in the refrigerator as if they were time-lapse metaphors for my own decay. The worst part wasn't the practical neglect. It was the way I'd started to move through space like I was apologizing for taking up room in the world. I'd catch myself making myself smaller in public, shoulders hunched, eyes down, as if maybe invisibility was preferable to being seen as the kind of woman whose husband disappears without explanation. Memory became my cruelest companion and my only entertainment. In the absence of a present that made sense, I found myself living in a past that had been retroactively poisoned by knowledge I couldn't unknow. I'd remember our second date, dinner at that little Italian place downtown where he'd told me about his childhood dog and his fear of commitment and how meeting me made him want to try being brave. I'd thought his vulnerability was evidence of intimacy, proof that he was letting me see the real him. Now I wondered if it had just been a practiced performance, lines he'd perfected through repetition with other women who'd believed they were special enough to be trusted with his secrets. Or our first vacation together. That long weekend at the lake where we'd stayed in bed until noon and talked about what we wanted our life to look like in 5 years, 10 years, forever. He'd traced patterns on my bare shoulder while describing the house we'd buy, the kids we'd have, the way we'd grow old together on a porch swing like some sort of greeting card romance. Had he meant any of it, or was I just an audience for the story he was telling himself about the kind of man he wanted to be? I'd excavate these memories like an archaeologist searching for artifacts that might explain how a civilization had disappeared so completely. Every shared laugh, every whispered, "I love you," every morning he'd brought me coffee in bed, I'd turn them over in my mind, looking for cracks that might have warned me this was all temporary, that I was falling in love with someone who was only visiting the role of devoted husband. The cruelest memories were the recent ones, the evidence that he'd been planning his exit while still going through the motions of our marriage. 2 weeks before he left, he'd helped me plant bulbs in our front garden, talking about how beautiful they'd be in the spring. 3 weeks before, he'd renewed our joint gym membership for another year. A month before, he'd discussed vacation plans for our upcoming anniversary. Either he was the kind of sociopath who could plan a betrayal while discussing flower gardens, or he'd made the decision to leave so suddenly that it surprised even him. I wasn't sure which possibility was more terrifying, living with a master manipulator or loving someone so unstable that he could incinerate 7 years of promises in a moment of impulse. Type identity. If you've ever wondered who you are when the person who defined you is gone, were those shared moments real? Or had I been in love with a performance? Had he ever actually seen me, or just a version of me that fit whatever role he needed filled in his life story? When he said he loved me, was he loving Sarah, or was he loving the idea of being the kind of man who was capable of love? The not knowing was almost worse than the leaving. I could have processed rejection. People fall out of love. Relationships run their course, sometimes forever end sooner than expected. But I couldn't process the possibility that none of it had ever been real, that I'd spent 7 years married to a mirage who'd finally evaporated in the heat of whatever truth he'd been hiding from both of us. Emma was the first casualty of my social disintegration. She'd called 3 times in the first week after Mark left, leaving voicemails that progressed from casual, "Hey, just checking in," to concerned, "Sarah, I'm starting to worry, call me back," to mildly frustrated, "Okay, I'm coming over if I don't hear from you by tonight." True to her word, she'd shown up at my door Friday evening with Thai takeout and the kind of determined cheerfulness that meant she'd prepared herself for disaster. I'd let her in because refusing would have required an explanation I didn't have, and we'd sat on my half-empty couch eating pad thai while she tried to fill the silence with updates about her job, her dating life, her mother's hip replacement surgery. It wasn't until she'd exhausted her repertoire of neutral topics that she'd finally asked, "So where's Mark tonight?" "Gone," I'd said, which was both the complete truth and completely inadequate. "Gone where? Business trip?" Gone. We're getting divorced." The look that crossed her face, shock, pity, curiosity, the slight discomfort that comes from being handed someone else's catastrophe without warning, was the first of many such expressions I'd learned to recognize and resent. It was the look of someone mentally recalibrating their understanding of my life, downgrading me from happily married friend to friend going through a difficult time to person who requires careful handling. She'd stayed another hour, asking gentle questions I couldn't answer and offering support I couldn't receive, before finally admitting she didn't know what to say or how to help. Her honesty was kinder than the alternative, but it left us both stranded in the awkward space between intimacy and inadequacy. After she left, I'd realized that losing Mark hadn't just cost me a husband, it had cost me my citizenship in the country of coupled people, my right to participate in conversations about vacation plans and home improvement projects, and the comfortable complaints of people whose biggest relationship problem was whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. Most of our mutual friends had chosen sides by default, which meant they'd chosen his side, since he was the one with the forwarding address and the explanation that didn't require them to sit with uncomfortable questions about the nature of love and commitment, and whether anyone really knows the person sleeping next to them. The friends who did reach out seemed to fall into 2 categories: those who wanted to treat my situation like a problem they could solve. "Have you tried therapy? Maybe this is just a rough patch." And those who wanted to treat it like entertainment. "I never liked him anyway. You're better off without him." Both responses felt like violations, attempts to colonize my grief with their own discomfort or curiosity. I stopped answering my phone, not because I didn't appreciate their concern, but because I couldn't bear the weight of managing other people's reactions to my tragedy while I was still figuring out how to survive it myself. 3 weeks into my new life as a single person, Emma sent a text that arrived at exactly the wrong moment, or maybe exactly the right one, depending on how you measure these things. I was standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, trying to remember if I liked granola or if Mark had been the granola person, when my phone buzzed with her message. "You're stronger than you think. I believe in you." The heart emoji felt like a tiny pink knife. Not because Emma didn't mean well, she absolutely did, but because "you're stronger than you think" is what people say when they need you to be stronger than you are, when your brokenness makes them uncomfortable enough to prescribe healing you haven't chosen yet. I stared at those words while fluorescent lights hummed overhead and other shoppers navigated around me with their normal lives and their normal grocery lists. Stronger than I think. But what if I thought I wasn't strong at all? What if strength felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, like makeup you put on for special occasions when you want people to think you're someone you're not? What if I didn't want to be strong yet? What if I wanted to be exactly as broken as I was, for exactly as long as it took, without having to perform recovery for people who loved me enough to want me healed, but not enough to love me while I was still bleeding? I deleted the text without responding, not because I was angry at Emma, but because reading it made me realize how much energy I'd been spending trying to seem okay for the benefit of people who needed me to be okay, more than they needed me to be honest. The deletion felt like a small act of rebellion, a tiny declaration of independence from the timeline of healing that other people had imposed on my grief. If I was going to fall apart, I was going to do it on my own schedule without having to apologize for not being strong enough, fast enough for the comfort of people who got to go home to their intact lives. By the end of my 4th week as a single woman, the practical realities of abandonment had started to assert themselves with the persistence of creditors who don't care about your emotional state. The mortgage payment was due, and our joint checking account still showed a balance of $47.32. Apparently Mark's idea of a fair division of assets. My own checking account, the one I'd used for personal expenses while he handled the big financial responsibilities, had enough to cover groceries for maybe another week if I stuck to ramen noodles and generic coffee. I'd called the bank, thinking surely there had been some mistake, some technical error that would be resolved with a simple phone call. But the customer service representative had been professionally sympathetic while explaining that Mark had every legal right to withdraw funds from accounts with his name on them, and that I'd need to speak with a lawyer about what recourse I might have in divorce proceedings that could take months to resolve. In the meantime, she'd suggested with the tone of someone who'd had this conversation before, you might want to consider opening your own account and establishing independent credit. Independent credit. As if independence was something you could apply for with the right paperwork and a decent credit score, rather than something that should have been built gradually over years of partnership that turned out to be an elaborate form of financial dependence I'd never consciously chosen. I'd driven home from the bank with a sick understanding of how quickly love could become a liability, how trust could transform into a weapon someone else wielded against your future. Mark hadn't just left me. He'd left me stranded, without resources, without the financial foundation to rebuild whatever life I was supposed to construct from the wreckage of the one I'd thought we were building together. That afternoon, I'd taken my wedding ring and the pearl earrings Mark had given me for our 5th anniversary to a pawn shop downtown, a place with bulletproof glass and fluorescent lighting that made everything look diseased. The man behind the counter had weighed my marriage in his palm and offered me $200 for symbols of love that had cost more than my monthly car payment. "Best I can do," he'd said with the indifference of someone who'd seen 1,000 other women trade their dreams for grocery money. I'd taken the cash and driven home with the strange lightness that comes from shedding weight you didn't realize you were carrying. The jewelry was gone, but so was the illusion that it had ever meant anything beyond the metal and stones it was made from. By my 6th week alone, the voice in my head had developed its own personality, cruel, persistent, logical in the way that depression is logical when you accept its premises about your fundamental worthlessness. The voice sounded like my own, but it said things I'd never consciously chosen to think. It provided running commentary on my daily failures, the way I looked in mirrors, the sound of my laugh when I tried to pretend I was fine, the pathetic sight of a woman eating cereal for dinner while watching Netflix shows about other people's functional relationships. "Look at you," the voice would say when I caught my reflection unexpectedly. "Look at what's left when someone actually gets to know you. This is why he ran. This is who you really are underneath all the pretending." The voice had an explanation for everything. When friends stopped calling, it was because I was exhausting to be around. When coworkers asked fewer questions about my personal life, it was because they could sense the failure radiating from me like a bad smell. When the cashier at the grocery store didn't make eye contact, it was because even strangers could tell I was the kind of person who gets abandoned. "I am nothing," became the thesis statement of my internal monologue. "He took everything, and what's left isn't worth the space it takes up in the world." The logic was airtight if you accepted the foundational premise that human worth is determined by other people's willingness to stay, that love is earned through performance, and that being left is proof of being fundamentally unlovable. Under those rules, Mark's departure wasn't just the end of our marriage, It was a verdict on my value as a human being, delivered by the person who knew me best, and therefore was most qualified to judge. If the man who'd promised to love me forever couldn't manage it for 7 years, what did that say about me? If someone who'd seen me without makeup, who'd watched me cry during sad movies, who'd held my hair back when I had food poisoning, if that person could walk away without explanation, what hope did I have of ever being truly known and chosen again? The voice had answers for these questions too, and none of them were kind. When everything is taken from you, what's left? But even as the voice cataloged my failures and inadequacies with scientific precision, some stubborn part of me was beginning to resist its conclusions. Not with arguments or evidence, I was too tired for hope, but with questions that felt dangerous to ask. What if the voice was wrong? What if being abandoned said more about the abandoner than the abandoned? What if Mark's ability to leave wasn't evidence of my unworthiness, but evidence of his inability to love anyone beyond the surface level required for performance? These questions felt like blasphemy against the religion of self-blame I'd been practicing, but they persisted like weeds growing through concrete, small and stubborn and surprisingly hard to kill. 7 weeks after Mark left, I'd developed a routine of spending Sunday afternoons at a coffee shop downtown, not because I particularly liked coffee or needed to be around people, but because sitting in my empty apartment had started to feel like practicing for death. The coffee shop was the kind of place where you could sit for hours without anyone expecting you to be social or productive, full of students with laptops and retirees with newspapers and people like me who were using public spaces as substitutes for lives that had become too small to contain their loneliness. I'd claimed a corner table where I could observe without being observed, nursing a latte that had gone cold an hour ago while pretending to read a book I'd been on the same page of for 3 weeks. It was a romance novel, a genre that had once felt like escapism, but now felt like science fiction, full of characters who believed in happy endings and men who kept their promises. That particular Sunday, I'd been trying not to cry while reading about a fictional couple working through their fictional problems with fictional communication skills, when a woman at the table next to mine knocked over her coffee cup. The coffee spread across her table and started dripping onto the floor, and she began fumbling for napkins with the kind of flustered embarrassment that comes from making a public mess when you're already feeling fragile. Without thinking, I grabbed a handful of napkins from my table and offered them to her. "Thank you, dear," she said, and something in her voice made me look at her more carefully. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair that caught the afternoon light and eyes that held the kind of deep peace that comes from a lifetime of walking with God through joy and sorrow. She was wearing a simple blue cardigan and pearl earrings, the kind of woman who probably sang in church choirs and volunteered at soup kitchens and still believed that kindness mattered in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. As she cleaned up the spilled coffee, she looked at me with the direct gaze that older women sometimes have, the kind that sees through the masks younger people wear. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. I started to give her the automatic response, "I'm fine, thank you." But something in her eyes stopped me. Maybe it was the way she was looking at me like I was worth seeing, or maybe it was the simple relief of being noticed by someone who wasn't expecting me to be anything other than what I was. "I am," I said instead, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. She nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if carrying heavy things was just part of being human, and admitting it was the beginning of wisdom. "You still have your soul," she said, like she was telling me the time or commenting on the weather. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. "You still have your soul." As if she could see something in me that I'd forgotten existed, as if there was some essential part of me that remained intact even when everything else had been stripped away. "I'm sorry," I said, because the words seemed too profound to have been spoken casually by a stranger in a coffee shop. "Your soul," she repeated, smiling with the patience of someone who'd learned that the most important truths often need to be said twice. "Whatever you've lost, whatever's been taken from you, you still have that. And that's not nothing. That's everything." She gathered her things and stood to leave, pausing beside my table long enough to touch my shoulder gently. "Take care of it," she said. "It's the only thing that's really yours." And then she was gone, disappearing into the Sunday afternoon crowd like some sort of angel who'd been assigned to patrol coffee shops for people who'd forgotten they were more than the sum of their circumstances. I sat at that table for another 2 hours, turning her words over in my mind like stones I was examining for hidden gems. You still have your soul. What did that even mean? And why did hearing it feel like someone had just reminded me of my own name after months of forgetting who I was? I drove home from the coffee shop in a strange state of agitation, like something inside me was trying to break free from a cage I'd built without realizing it. The old woman's words had lodged themselves in my chest like seeds planted in winter soil, and I could feel something stirring that I didn't have a name for yet. Back in my apartment, I tried to distract myself with the usual Sunday evening routine. Laundry, meal prep for the week, whatever mindless TV show would fill the silence until it was time to sleep. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility I wasn't ready to acknowledge. It was while folding towels that the dam finally broke. I'd pulled one of our bath towels from the dryer, one of the good ones Mark had left behind, apparently deciding it wasn't worth the trunk space, and caught a faint whiff of the detergent we'd always used together. It was such a small thing, barely perceptible, but it hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly, I was sobbing. Not the careful, controlled tears I'd been rationing for weeks, but the kind of crying that comes from your bones, that uses your whole body, that demands every breath and leaves you gasping like you're drowning in your own grief. But this wasn't just sadness, this was rage. Rage at Mark for leaving without explanation, rage at myself for not seeing it coming, rage at God for allowing me to love someone who was always planning to leave, rage at the universe for being the kind of place where promises could be broken and hearts could be shattered and 7 years could be erased with a typed note left on a kitchen table. I screamed into the towel I was holding, muffling the sound so my neighbors wouldn't call the police, but letting my body express what my words couldn't contain. I screamed until my throat was raw, until I'd expelled every molecule of anger and despair and betrayal that had been festering inside me for 2 months. When the screaming stopped, when I was sitting on my laundry room floor surrounded by half-folded towels and the wreckage of my carefully maintained composure, I heard something I hadn't heard in months. My mother's voice. Not literally. My mother lived 3 states away and had no idea how close I'd come to complete emotional collapse. But I heard her voice from memory, from childhood, from the nights when I was small and scared and needed someone to remind me that I was safe, that I was loved, that morning always came after the darkest nights. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, I heard her say in the same gentle tone she'd used to read me bedtime stories and Bible verses and all the words that had shaped my understanding of what it meant to be held by love that couldn't be shaken. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Isaiah 43:2. I knew the reference without having to look it up, the way you know the lyrics to songs that played during the most important moments of your life. My mother had read it to me during thunderstorms and before surgery, and the night my grandfather died, teaching me that some promises were stronger than circumstances, that some love was deeper than human understanding. But I felt swept away. I felt burned. I felt like the waters had closed over my head, and I was drowning in the wreckage of everything I'd thought I could count on. Maybe God hadn't left. Maybe she had. Or maybe, and this was the dangerous thought that had been growing stronger since the coffee shop encounter, maybe being swept away and being destroyed weren't the same thing. Maybe you could lose everything visible and still have something essential intact. Maybe the waters I was passing through weren't meant to drown me, but to wash away everything that wasn't really me, leaving behind only what couldn't be stolen or abandoned or dissolved. Maybe I still had my soul, just like the angel in the coffee shop had said. And maybe that was enough to build a life on, even if I didn't know what that life was going to look like yet. I don't know what made me get on my knees. I'd never been particularly religious, never the kind of person who knelt beside beds or lit candles or talked to God like he was sitting in the room with me. But something about the way I was feeling, empty and full at the same time, broken and somehow whole, seemed to require a different posture than sitting or standing. So I knelt on my laundry room floor, surrounded by evidence of my ordinary life continuing, despite its complete disruption, and tried to remember how to pray. The words didn't come easily. I'd spent 2 months feeling abandoned by everyone, including God, and approaching him now felt like calling someone who'd ignored your messages for weeks. What if he didn't answer? What if he did? What if the silence I'd been interpreting as absence was actually presence taking a form I didn't recognize? "If you're there," I whispered to the God I wasn't sure was listening, "say something." It wasn't much of a prayer, no eloquent theology, no careful requests, no promises about what I'd do differently if he'd just fix my circumstances. Just the honest plea of someone who'd run out of other options, who'd discovered that self-reliance was a luxury she couldn't afford when herself had been shattered into pieces too small to rely on. "I don't know how to do this," I continued, the words coming easier now that I'd started. "I don't know how to be alone, how to rebuild, how to trust that anything good will ever happen to me again. I don't even know if you care about any of this, if divorce and abandonment and broken hearts matter to you, or if you're too busy with bigger problems to notice one woman falling apart in her laundry room." The silence that followed wasn't the hostile silence I'd expected. It was attentive, patient, like someone listening carefully to words they'd been waiting to hear. "I don't need you to fix everything," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "I just need to know that I'm not completely alone in this, that there's something, someone, anything that won't leave me when things get hard." I stayed on my knees for maybe 5 more minutes, not because I felt God's presence in any dramatic way, but because standing up felt like ending a conversation I wasn't ready to finish. The laundry room floor was hard against my knees, the fluorescent light was harsh overhead, and I still looked like someone who'd been crying for an hour. But something had shifted, not healed. Healing would come later, slower, in pieces I couldn't predict. But shifted, like a door that had been locked for months, had finally been opened just wide enough to let in the possibility of hope. When I finally stood up, my knees aching and my eyes still swollen from crying, I felt different. Not better exactly, but different. Like I'd remembered something important that I'd forgotten, or like someone had reminded me of my real name after months of being called by names that didn't belong to me. That night, I slept better than I had since Mark left. Not because my circumstances had changed. I was still alone, still financially precarious, still facing a future that looked nothing like the one I'd planned. But because I'd remembered that I wasn't just the woman whose husband left. I was also the woman with a soul, the woman worth speaking to, the woman who could survive waters deep enough to drown in. And maybe, just maybe, I was the woman God had been waiting for all along. Not the perfect wife who never got abandoned, but the broken woman who finally had nothing left to lose by being honest about how much she needed to be loved. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. The hardest person to forgive wasn't my husband. It was myself. And that's where real healing had to begin. 3 days after my laundry room breakdown, I did something I hadn't done since high school. I bought a journal. Not because I thought writing would fix anything, but because the thoughts in my head had become so loud and chaotic that I needed somewhere to put them before they drove me completely insane. I'd walked into the bookstore downtown with no particular purpose, just seeking the comfort of being surrounded by other people's words when my own felt too dangerous to think. But there, on a display table near the front, was a simple leather-bound journal with blank pages that seemed to be waiting for someone exactly like me. Someone with too much pain and not enough ways to express it. The first entries were barely coherent, just angry scribbles that looked like they'd been written by someone having a seizure. Pages of "I hate him" and "How could he do this?" and variations of "Why me?" scratched into the paper with enough force to leave indentations on the pages beneath. But after a week of this therapeutic vandalism, something strange started to happen. Patterns began to emerge from the chaos, themes that repeated like musical motifs in a composition I hadn't realized I was writing. This is where I learned the difference between what happened to me and what I made it mean about me. He blamed me for things I didn't do, I wrote one morning, the words appearing on the page before I'd consciously decided to think them. He got angry when I was happy, appeared the next day. He made me feel guilty for having friends, came after that. He said I was too sensitive every time he hurt my feelings. He told me I was lucky he loved me because no one else would. Reading these sentences back to myself was like looking at evidence of a crime I'd been too close to see while it was happening. Each entry revealed another piece of a pattern I'd been living inside, but couldn't recognize from within. The gradual erosion of my sense of reality, the slow-motion gaslighting that had convinced me his emotional distance was my fault, his cruelty was my sensitivity, his inability to love was my inadequacy. The revelation that had been building for weeks finally crystallized as I sat at my kitchen table, reading through 2 weeks' worth of journaled memories. Mark hadn't left because I wasn't enough. He'd left because he was incapable of the kind of love that sees another person clearly and chooses them anyway. The more I wrote, the more I began to see our last year together through a different lens, not as the gradual decline of a marriage, but as the gradual revelation of someone who'd been performing marriage rather than living it. I remembered the way he'd started working later and later, claiming new projects and demanding clients, but never quite able to explain what he was working on when I asked. I remembered how he'd stopped touching me casually, no more hand on my shoulder while I cooked dinner, no more fingers brushing mine when he handed me coffee, no more unconscious intimacy of people who'd grown comfortable in each other's space. I remembered the way he'd started picking fights about small things, the dishes I'd left in the sink, the way I loaded the dishwasher, whether I'd remembered to move his laundry from the washer to the dryer. At the time, I'd thought he was just stressed, that work pressure was making him irritable. Now I could see those fights for what they really were, his subconscious trying to create enough distance to justify the abandonment he was already planning. The cruelest revelation was understanding how he'd used my love against me. Every time I'd tried to address problems in our relationship, he'd turned it back on me. I was being needy, demanding, impossible to please. When I'd asked for more emotional intimacy, he'd accused me of being clingy. When I'd requested more help around the house, he'd made me feel guilty for not appreciating how hard he worked. When I'd expressed hurt over his emotional distance, he'd told me I was too sensitive, that I expected too much. He'd been systematically training me to accept less and less, while blaming myself for wanting what should have been basic components of partnership. By the time he left, I'd been so thoroughly convinced that I was the problem that his departure felt like inevitable consequences for my failure to be a better wife. But the man writing those accusations in arguments, the man who could make me feel selfish for wanting to be treated with kindness, that man had been projecting his own shame onto me because it was easier than admitting he'd never learned how to love anyone beyond the surface level required for social performance. 2 weeks into my journaling practice, I'd finally worked up the courage to call a therapist. Not because I believed therapy would fix me, I was too tired for that kind of optimism, but because I was starting to worry that the voice in my head telling me I was worthless might not be entirely trustworthy. And I needed someone trained in untangling thoughts to help me figure out which ones belonged to me and which ones belonged to the shame I'd been carrying. Dr. Martinez had the kind of office that was designed to make broken people feel safe. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, tissues strategically placed within easy reach. She was probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every variation of human pain and still believed in the possibility of healing. For the first 20 minutes of our first session, I sat in her comfortable chair and said absolutely nothing. Not because I didn't have anything to say, I had volumes to say, but because speaking the truth about my marriage out loud felt like a form of betrayal I wasn't ready to commit. "Take your time," she'd said, and somehow the permission to be silent made words possible. "I wasn't enough," I finally whispered, and saying it felt like confessing to a crime I'd committed against myself. Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression curious rather than judgmental. "What makes you think that?" "Because he left," I said, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world, because after 7 years of trying to be what he needed, I still wasn't worth staying for. "Or," she said gently, "he was incapable of staying." The possibility hung in the air between us like a door I could choose to walk through or ignore. Incapable of staying. Not unwilling to stay because I wasn't worth it, but incapable of staying because staying requires skills he'd never developed. "Tell me about the last year of your marriage," she said, and for the next 40 minutes I found myself describing a relationship that sounded increasingly toxic when spoken aloud to someone who wasn't invested in protecting my illusions about it. If this story is opening old wounds, hit that like button. Sometimes healing hurts before it helps. It sounds like you were working very hard to be loved by someone who wasn't actually available for love, Dr. Martinez observed when I'd finished my recitation of efforts and failures. But I must have done something wrong, I insisted. People don't just leave good marriages. You're right, she agreed. They don't. But they do leave marriages to people they're not capable of truly seeing or choosing. The question isn't whether you were enough. The question is whether he was. Over the following weeks, therapy became archaeology, carefully excavating years of buried memories and examining them for evidence of truths I'd been too close to see. I remembered the time I'd gotten a promotion at work and called him excitedly to share the news, only to have him respond with concern about how the additional responsibilities might affect my availability to manage household tasks. No congratulations, no celebration, just immediate worry about how my success might inconvenience him. I remembered the dinner party where I'd spent all day cooking and cleaning, then spent the evening serving our guests and cleaning up afterward, while he entertained everyone with stories that painted him as the hero of every anecdote. When one of our friends had complimented the meal, he'd said, "Yeah, she's pretty good in the kitchen," as if my effort was a performance for his benefit rather than a gift I'd chosen to give. I remembered the night I'd had food poisoning and had asked him to pick up medicine on his way home from work. He'd arrived 3 hours later without the medicine, explaining that he'd stopped at happy hour with colleagues and forgotten. When I'd cried from frustration and illness, he'd accused me of being dramatic and unreasonable. Each memory was like finding another piece of a puzzle that revealed a picture I'd never wanted to see. A marriage where one person was always giving and the other was always taking, where one person was always accommodating and the other was always accommodated, where one person was visible and the other was essentially invisible, except as a supporting character in someone else's story. The question Dr. Martinez had asked during our third session echoed in my mind as I drove home from therapy. How long have you been shrinking yourself just to keep someone else from leaving? How long have you been shrinking yourself just to keep someone else from leaving? Forever, I realized. I'd been shrinking myself my entire adult life, making myself smaller and quieter, and less demanding in the hope that if I required little enough, maybe someone would choose to keep me. I'd confused love with accommodation, partnership with servitude, commitment with my willingness to disappear myself for someone else's comfort. I'd been so busy trying to be the kind of woman who deserved to be chosen that I'd forgotten to notice whether the person doing the choosing was actually worth being chosen by. 3 months into therapy, Dr. Martinez said something that felt like being struck by lightning. Your worth wasn't his to give, so it couldn't be his to take. I stared at her, trying to process the revolutionary idea that my value as a human being might be independent of Mark's opinion of me, that his decision to leave might be evidence of his limitations rather than mine. But if I was worth loving, wouldn't he have stayed? I asked, clinging to the logic that had been torturing me for months. If he was capable of love, wouldn't he have stayed? She countered. The question isn't whether you were lovable. The question is whether he had the capacity for love. I was carrying shame that was never mine to carry. Watch what happens when you put down weight that isn't yours. She explained it like this. Imagine someone colorblind insisting that a red rose was gray. Their inability to see red wouldn't make the rose less red. It would just reveal something about their vision. Mark's inability to see my worth didn't make me worthless. It revealed something about his capacity for recognition, for gratitude, for the kind of love that sees clearly and chooses consistently. You've been trying to solve the wrong problem, Dr. Martinez said gently. You've been trying to figure out how to be worth staying for, when the real problem was that you chose someone who was constitutionally incapable of staying. That night, I found myself kneeling beside my bed for the second time since Mark left, but this prayer felt different from the desperate plea I'd whispered in my laundry room. This felt like a conversation with someone I was beginning to trust with the truth. God, I don't trust you yet, but I want to. The words came out before I'd planned them. and they felt like the most honest theology I'd ever practiced. I didn't trust God with my future, didn't trust that good things were coming, didn't trust that my story would have a happy ending. But I was beginning to trust him with my brokenness, my confusion, my need to be seen clearly by someone. I've been carrying shame that doesn't belong to me, I continued, testing out Dr. Martinez's words in the context of prayer. I've been trying to earn love from someone who wasn't capable of giving it. I've been shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. The verse my mother had read to me as a child began appearing in my mind with increasing frequency, but now it felt less like a promise of rescue and more like a promise of presence. God wasn't promising to take me around the fire. He was promising to walk through it with me, to be present in the burning without necessarily preventing the burning. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, I whispered into the darkness of my bedroom. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Maybe the point wasn't to avoid deep waters or intense flames. Maybe the point was to discover that I could survive them, that there was something in me, my soul, as the coffee shop angel had said, that was fireproof and floodproof and abandonment-proof. I started visiting the library, not for escape, but for evidence. Evidence that other women had survived what felt unsurvivable, that other hearts had been broken and mended, that other marriages had ended, and other lives had begun from the ashes of what had been lost. I read memoirs of women who'd been left, who'd been cheated on, who'd discovered that the men they'd trusted with their hearts and futures were strangers wearing familiar faces. I read about women who'd rebuilt from nothing, who'd discovered strength they didn't know they possessed, who'd learned that the end of one story could be the beginning of a better one. Each book was like finding another survivor of the same shipwreck, another woman who'd learned to swim in waters that had initially seemed impossible to navigate. They wrote about the shame, the self-doubt, the way betrayal can make you question every decision you'd ever made and every instinct you'd ever trusted. But they also wrote about the other side, the unexpected relief of no longer having to manage someone else's emotional immaturity, the freedom of no longer having to shrink themselves to fit into relationships that were too small, the surprising joy of discovering who they were when they weren't performing for someone else's approval. 4 months after Mark left, during a therapy session where I was describing my latest journaling revelations, Dr. Martinez asked me a question that stopped me cold. Do you think you deserved what happened to you? I opened my mouth to say yes. Of course I deserved it. I must have done something wrong, must have failed in some fundamental way to end up abandoned and financially devastated. But the word stuck in my throat. I started, then stopped. I don't know. Let me ask you this, she said. If your best friend came to you and told you her husband had emptied their bank accounts and disappeared without explanation, leaving her to figure out how to survive on her own, what would you tell her? Would you tell her she deserved it? Of course not, I said immediately. I'd tell her she deserved better, that what happened to her was cruel and wrong, that no one deserves to be abandoned like that. So why is it different when it's you? The question hung in the air like a challenge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to accept. Why was it different when it was me? Why did I hold myself to standards of perfection that I'd never apply to anyone else? Why did I assume that bad things happened to me because I deserved them, when I'd never make that assumption about anyone else I loved? I didn't deserve what happened, I whispered, and saying it felt like speaking a foreign language I was just learning to pronounce. Say it again, Doctor, Martinez encouraged. I didn't deserve what happened to me, I repeated, and this time it felt less foreign, more like a truth I was finally ready to own. Mark's decision to leave says something about Mark, I continued, the words gaining strength as I spoke them. It doesn't say anything about my worth as a person or my capacity to be loved or my value as a human being. For the first time in 4 months, I felt something that had been missing since the morning I'd found his note. Righteous anger. Not the destructive kind that burns everything down, but the clarifying kind that distinguishes between what's mine to carry and what belongs to someone else. I was angry at Mark for being a coward, for taking the easy way out instead of doing the hard work of honest communication. I was angry at him for making me feel responsible for his inability to love consistently. I was angry at him for stealing my financial security and my peace of mind and my trust in my own perceptions. But I was no longer angry at myself for failing to be perfect enough to prevent someone else's cruelty. I was no longer carrying responsibility for choices that had never been mine to make. The truth had indeed set me free, just like the Bible promised. But first, as Dr. Martinez had warned me, it had made me miserable. Miserable enough to stop accepting treatment I'd never deserved. Miserable enough to start expecting better, miserable enough to begin the slow work of rebuilding my life on a foundation of truth instead of shame. That evening, I wrote in my journal, "Today, I learned the difference between what happened to me and what it means about me. What happened to me was cruel and wrong. What it means about me is that I'm strong enough to survive cruelty, brave enough to seek help, and valuable enough to deserve better. Mark's leaving doesn't make me less. It makes him less capable of recognizing what he had." The words felt like a declaration of independence from the prison I'd built in my own mind, a manifesto of worth that no one else could write for me because no one else could take it away. I was learning that the hardest person to forgive wasn't the one who'd abandoned me. It was the one who'd convinced herself she deserved to be abandoned. But that woman, I was discovering, had been operating with faulty information. She'd been told lies about her value and had believed them because they came from someone who claimed to love her. The woman I was becoming knew better. She knew that love doesn't leave, that real partnership doesn't require one person to disappear, that worth isn't conditional on someone else's ability to recognize it. She knew that some things can't be stolen because they were never given by humans in the first place. They were written into her DNA by the God who'd knit her together in her mother's womb, who'd known her before she'd known herself, who'd called her beloved before anyone else had the chance to call her anything else. And that knowledge, once claimed, was unshakable. The truth will set you free, but first, it will make you miserable. John 8:32. Healing didn't come with fanfare. It came with morning sunlight and the simple decision to make my bed. 6 months after Mark left, I woke up on a Saturday morning and noticed something I hadn't seen in half a year. The way sunlight fell across my bedroom floor in a perfect rectangle of gold, transforming my ordinary hardwood into something that looked almost sacred. For months, I'd been waking up to the same room, the same light, the same morning routine, but I'd been seeing all of it through the filter of grief that made everything appear gray and lifeless. This morning, something had shifted, not dramatically, not with angels singing or divine visions, but with the quiet revolution of noticing beauty again. I sat on the edge of my bed for a few minutes, letting the warmth touch my bare feet, and realized I was experiencing something I'd almost forgotten existed. Contentment. Not happiness. I wasn't ready for anything that ambitious, but the simple peace that comes from being present in your own life instead of constantly wishing you were somewhere else. Without thinking about it, I stood up and made my bed. Not because anyone was coming over, not because I was trying to impose order on chaos, but because the woman sitting in that patch of sunlight deserved to live in a space that reflected her worth. The bed-making was a small act of self-respect, a tiny declaration that I was worth the 30 seconds it took to smooth sheets and fluff pillows. Watch what happens when you stop waiting for your circumstances to change and start changing how you carry your circumstances. It was such a small thing, but it felt revolutionary. The first thing I'd done in 6 months that was for me, not to me or despite me, but genuinely for my own comfort and dignity. As I smoothed the comforter and arranged the pillows, I caught sight of myself in the dresser mirror and realized I was smiling. Just slightly, barely perceptible, but real. That afternoon, I found myself in a thrift store downtown, not because I needed anything specific, but because I'd started taking walks through different neighborhoods as a form of therapy. And this particular store had caught my attention with its window display of vintage books and mismatched teacups. Thrift stores had become safe spaces for me, places where broken things were valued, where imperfection was expected, where nothing was trying to be anything other than what it was. I wandered through the aisles of donated lives, running my fingers along clothes that had been loved by other people, books that had been read by other minds, dishes that had served other families. I was examining a vintage scarf when I heard soft crying from the next aisle over. Peering around a rack of winter coats, I saw a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, standing in front of a display of prom dresses with tears streaming down her face. She was holding up a pale blue dress that had probably been beautiful once, but now showed the wear of someone else's special night. A small stain near the hem, a loose thread at the shoulder, the kind of imperfections that made it affordable for someone who needed affordable. Something about her posture, shoulders hunched in embarrassment, looking around to make sure no one was watching her cry, reminded me of myself 6 months ago, ashamed of my circumstances, trying to hold myself together in public spaces. I walked over and knelt beside her, pulling a tissue from my purse. "Hey," I said gently. "You okay?" She looked up at me with eyes that held the particular desperation of someone young enough to believe that high school problems are the end of the world and old enough to understand that life isn't fair. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the way people always say they're fine when they're the opposite of fine. "The dress is beautiful," I said, and I meant it. Even with its imperfections, even marked by someone else's memories, it was still beautiful. "I can't afford a new one," she whispered, as if admitting to poverty was a crime. "All my friends are getting their dresses at the mall, and I'm shopping at Goodwill like some kind of charity case." Looking at her, I saw myself at 16, not dealing with divorce and abandonment, but facing my own set of circumstances that felt insurmountable at the time. I saw every woman who'd ever felt like she didn't have enough, wasn't enough, couldn't afford the life she wanted to live. "Can I tell you something?" I said, settling more comfortably on my knees beside her. "The most beautiful woman I knew in high school wore a thrift store dress to prom. Not because she had to, but because she found this incredible vintage gown that had more character and style than anything in the mall. She looked like a movie star, and everyone wanted to know where she'd gotten it." The girl looked at me skeptically, but she was listening. "And you know what I learned from her? Beauty isn't about how much you spend. It's about how you carry yourself. It's about confidence, about believing you deserve to take up space in the world. This dress doesn't define you. You define the dress." She wiped her eyes with the tissue I'd given her and looked at the dress again, this time seeing it through different eyes. "You really think it's beautiful?" she asked. "I think you're beautiful," I said, "and I think any dress would be lucky to be worn by someone who has the courage to find beauty in unexpected places." She bought the dress, and I bought the vintage scarf I'd been examining, and as we walked to the parking lot together, she thanked me for not walking away when she was crying. "Sometimes we all need someone to see us," I told her, remembering the coffee shop angel who'd seen my soul when I couldn't see it myself. Driving home, I realized something profound had just happened. For 6 months, I'd been so focused on what had been taken from me that I'd forgotten I still had something to give. The girl in the thrift store had reminded me that my own brokenness hadn't disqualified me from helping other people with theirs. If anything, it had qualified me in ways that wholeness never could have. The following week, I did something I hadn't done since before Mark left. I called the church I'd been avoiding and asked if they needed volunteers for their weekly community dinner. Not because I'd suddenly found my faith again, but because the thrift store encounter had awakened something in me that felt like purpose. The volunteer coordinator, a woman named Linda with gray hair and laugh lines that suggested she'd found joy in service, welcomed me without asking why I'd been absent or what had brought me back. She handed me an apron and put me to work serving plates of spaghetti and garlic bread to anyone who needed a meal and a place to belong for an hour. The people who came to the dinner were a cross-section of human need: elderly people on fixed incomes, families struggling to make ends meet, homeless individuals who carried their lives in shopping carts, teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere else to go. But there were also volunteers who'd once been guests, people who'd found their footing and come back to help others find theirs. I found myself working alongside women whose stories were different from mine, but whose pain was familiar. There was Margaret, whose husband had died suddenly and left her drowning in medical debt. There was Carmen, who'd escaped an abusive marriage with nothing but her 2 small children and the clothes on their backs. There was Joyce, whose adult son's addiction had consumed her savings and her peace of mind. Each woman carried scars that had been transformed into strength, wounds that had become sources of wisdom, losses that had taught them how to recognize and respond to other people's losses. They didn't try to fix each other or offer platitudes about everything happening for a reason. They just worked side by side, creating something good from their collective understanding of what it meant to be broken and still breathing. After my third week of volunteering, Linda pulled me aside as we were cleaning up. "I don't know what brought you here," she said, "but I want you to know that you have a gift for this. You have a way of seeing people, of making them feel valued. Several of our guests have mentioned how much your kindness meant to them." Then she said something that nearly broke me open. "You look peaceful. Not happy exactly, but peaceful. Like you found your footing." Peaceful. I carried that word home with me like a treasure, turning it over in my mind as I drove through the evening darkness. When had I become peaceful? When had the constant storm inside me calmed enough for other people to notice? I realized that peace hadn't come from getting my old life back. It had come from accepting my new life, from finding ways to be useful in my brokenness rather than waiting to be useful after I was healed. That night, I found myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, the same mirror where I'd failed to recognize myself 6 months ago. The woman looking back at me was still marked by everything that had happened. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of gravity in her expression that spoke of hard-won wisdom, a quality of attention that suggested she'd learned to notice things she'd previously taken for granted. But she also looked like someone who belonged in her own skin, someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to exist, someone who'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. I touched my reflection gently, the way you might touch the face of a friend you're proud of, and smiled. Not because my circumstances were perfect, but because I was learning to love the woman who'd survived them, the woman who'd been abandoned but hadn't abandoned herself, the woman who'd lost almost everything but discovered she was more than the sum of what she owned or what others thought of her. I missed Mark sometimes, not the man he'd actually been, but the man I'd thought he was, the partnership I'd believed we had, the future I'd imagined we were building together. But missing that imaginary life no longer felt like evidence that my current life was inadequate. It felt like grief for something that had never been real, and grief, I was learning, could coexist with peace. Standing in my bedroom that night, looking around at the space that had once felt like a museum of abandonment, I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room. He took the furniture, the money, even the dreams I built around him, but he couldn't take this. I paused, searching for words to name what felt unnameable. The woman I am becoming. The woman I was becoming. Not the woman I used to be. That woman had been too willing to disappear herself for someone else's comfort. Not the woman I thought I should be. That woman existed only in comparison to other people's expectations. But the woman I was actually becoming in the aftermath of losing everything I'd thought I needed. This woman was braver than the one who'd been too afraid of abandonment to risk being authentic. She was more generous than the one who'd been too worried about her own security to notice other people's needs. She was more peaceful than the one who'd been constantly performing for love instead of trusting that she was worthy of love exactly as she was. Comment peaceful. If you've discovered that healing happens in the ordinary moments, not just the miraculous ones. This was when I realized that the woman I was becoming was worth everything I'd lost to find her. Not because the loss had been necessary or good, but because the strength I had discovered in surviving it was mine to keep, regardless of what happened next. Prayer had become a daily conversation rather than an emergency hotline I called only during crises. Every morning, sitting in that patch of sunlight with my coffee, I'd spend a few minutes talking to God about the day ahead, the challenges I was facing, the small joys I was learning to notice. The prayers weren't eloquent or theologically sophisticated. They were more like updates you'd give to a friend who cared about the details of your life. Help me be present with the people I serve today. Thank you for the woman who smiled at me in the grocery store. I'm still scared about money, but I'm trusting you with tomorrow. God's presence no longer felt like something I had to earn through perfect faith or correct theology. It felt like companionship, like having someone who walked through each day with me without needing to fix everything that was broken or answer every question that was confusing. His whisper felt closer now, less like thunder and more like breath. Not the dramatic interventions I'd once prayed for, but the subtle presence that made ordinary moments feel sacred, that turned my small apartment into a sanctuary, that transformed my daily routines into acts of worship simply because I was learning to be grateful for the gift of being alive. Have you ever realized the greatest thing you still have is you? On my way home from volunteering one evening, I stopped at the park where Mark and I used to take walks during the early years of our marriage. I'd been avoiding it for months, afraid that the memories would undo the progress I'd been making. But as I sat on a bench watching the wind move through the oak trees that had been there long before my marriage and would be there long after my divorce, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain I'd endured, but gratitude for what had survived the pain. Gratitude for the strength I had discovered, for the purpose I had found, for the peace that had grown in soil I'd thought was too broken to support new life. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above me with the sound of 10,000 small applause, and I found myself whispering a prayer I'd never planned to pray. Thank you for not letting me burn. Thank you for walking with me through waters that felt deep enough to drown in. Thank you for preserving something essential when everything else was being stripped away. Thank you for showing me that I was more than what happened to me, stronger than what was done to me, worth more than what someone else decided I was worth. Thank you for teaching me that I could be alone without being abandoned, that I could be broken without being worthless, that I could lose almost everything and still have enough to build a life worth living. The prayer wasn't for rescue from my circumstances. It was for recognition of what had already been rescued. My soul, as the coffee shop angel had called it, my essential self, the part of me that couldn't be taken by someone who'd never really seen it in the first place. As I walked back to my car through the evening twilight, I realized I was no longer the woman who'd been left 6 months ago. I was the woman who'd chosen to stay with herself, stay in her own life, stay open to possibility even when the future looked nothing like what she'd planned. And that woman, I was discovering, was someone worth staying for. That night, as I prepared for sleep in the home I'd made from the wreckage of the one I'd shared, I offered one final prayer of gratitude. Thank you for showing me that some treasures are theft-proof. Thank you for teaching me that the most valuable things I possess were never given to me by another person, so they can never be taken by another person. Thank you for proving that I am enough, exactly as I am, not because someone chooses me, but because you chose me first. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of presence, thick with peace, rich with the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to discover just how much life was possible when you stopped waiting for someone else to give you permission to live it. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. Psalm 23, 2-3. Forgiveness didn't make what he did okay. It made me okay with what God was doing through it. 8 months after Mark disappeared from my life, he reappeared in my mailbox, not in person, but in the form of a handwritten letter that sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. The envelope was addressed in his familiar scrawl, the same handwriting that had once written love notes and grocery lists and birthday cards that promised forever. Seeing it again felt like encountering a ghost, evidence that the man who'd vanished so completely was still somewhere in the world, still thinking thoughts and forming letters, and apparently still thinking about me. For 72 hours, I carried that unopened letter around like a bomb that might detonate if handled incorrectly. I'd pick it up, then put it down. Hold it up to the light as if I could divine its contents through the envelope. Set it on my nightstand, then move it to the kitchen, then back to the counter where I'd found it. Part of me was terrified it would be cruel, a legal document or a demand for something I couldn't give. Another part was terrified it would be kind, an apology that might reopen wounds I'd worked so hard to heal, or worse, an attempt at reconciliation that would force me to choose between forgiveness and self-protection. But the part of me that had been growing stronger over the past 8 months was simply curious. What did the man who'd left me with a typed note and an empty bank account have to say now? What words had taken him 8 months to find? On Thursday evening, after volunteering at the community dinner and sharing a table with women who'd taught me that survival could become strength, I finally opened the letter. His handwriting was messier than I remembered, as if it had been written quickly or with shaking hands. The paper was expensive, the kind of stationery he'd always used for important business correspondence, but the words were anything but businesslike. "Sarah," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you after what I did, and I know this letter is coming far too late to matter in any way that counts, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. Not because I think saying it will fix anything, but because you deserved to hear it 8 months ago, and I was too much of a coward to stay long enough to say it." I read those first lines 3 times before continuing, trying to reconcile the humble tone with the man who'd left me to figure out my own survival. "I've been in therapy since I left," the letter continued, "trying to understand how I became someone who could do what I did to you. I know that doesn't excuse anything, and I know my healing doesn't undo your hurt, but I wanted you to know that I see now how cruel I was, how selfish, how completely I failed at being the partner you deserved." The letter was 3 pages long, full of insights that would have saved our marriage if he'd been capable of them while we were still married. He wrote about his fear of commitment, his pattern of running when relationships required real intimacy, his tendency to blame others for his own emotional unavailability. He wrote about the shame that had driven him to destroy something good rather than risk not being good enough for it. "I know you probably hate me," he wrote near the end, "and I understand if you do, but I hope someday you'll believe that the problem was never you. You were more than I deserved, better than I knew how to appreciate, stronger than I was brave enough to let myself need. I destroyed our marriage because I was broken, not because you weren't enough." Reading his words, I felt something I hadn't expected: compassion. Not the kind that wanted to rescue him or resume our relationship, but the sad recognition of someone who'd wounded others because he'd never learned to heal his own wounds. The man who'd written this letter was clearly in pain, clearly struggling with guilt and regret and the consequences of choices he couldn't undo. But his pain no longer felt like my responsibility to manage. His guilt no longer felt like evidence of my worth. His regret no longer felt like an invitation for me to fix what he'd broken. The letter that once would have destroyed me became evidence of how far I'd traveled toward freedom. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in the drawer with my journal and other documents from this chapter of my life. Not because I wanted to preserve it, but because it was part of the story, evidence of the journey both of us had taken since that typed note on the kitchen table. It took me a week to decide whether to respond, and another week to find the words that felt both honest and kind. When I finally sat down to write back, I surprised myself with how little I had to say and how peaceful I felt saying it. "Mark," I wrote, "thank you for your letter and for your apology. I can see that you've been doing hard work to understand what happened between us, and I'm glad you're getting the help you needed. I want you to know that I forgive you, not because what you did was okay, and not because I'm hoping we can rebuild what was broken, but because carrying anger toward you was costing me more than it was worth. Forgiveness, I've learned, is something I do for myself, not something I give to other people. I've spent the past 8 months rebuilding my life from the ground up, and I've discovered things about myself that I never would have known if our marriage had continued. I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient than I knew, and more capable of creating a meaningful life than I'd ever imagined. I don't hate you, Mark. I don't wish you harm. I hope you find the peace and healing you're looking for. But I also don't want to maintain contact or attempt to rebuild any kind of relationship. This chapter of my life is closed, and I'm ready to see what comes next. I hope you understand, and I hope you continue to grow into the man you want to be. With peace, Sarah." When I sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. It was like exhaling a breath I'd been holding for 8 months, letting go of the last thread that connected me to a life that was finished. The response hadn't been about him. It had been about me claiming the right to close the door on my own terms, to offer forgiveness from a place of strength rather than weakness, to choose peace over perpetual anger. Walking home from the mailbox, I realized that this was what closure felt like, not the dramatic confrontation I'd sometimes imagined, not tearful reconciliation I'd sometimes hoped for, but the quiet satisfaction of handling a difficult situation with grace and walking away with my dignity intact. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I browsed college catalogs, not because I needed more education for career advancement, but because I'd started to remember that learning could be joy rather than obligation, that growing could be an act of self-love rather than self-improvement. I'd always wanted to study art, but had been practical instead, choosing a major that would lead to stable employment rather than following interests that felt too frivolous to support a life. Now, looking at course descriptions for painting and sculpture and art history, I felt the flutter of excitement I'd forgotten was possible. You don't have to rebuild the same life you had. You can build something new, with God. Maybe I'd take a class or two at the community college. Maybe I'd travel to places I'd always wanted to see but had postponed for some day when we could afford it together. Maybe I'd move to a different city, start fresh somewhere I could be someone new rather than someone recovering from who I used to be. The future had stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like possibility. Not because I was running from my current life, but because I'd finally learned to trust myself to build a life worth living, with or without someone else's participation. 3 weeks later, at the community dinner, a young woman approached me during cleanup. She was maybe 25, with the hollow eyes of someone who'd recently learned that love doesn't always last as long as promises suggest it will. "I heard you went through a divorce," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I was wondering, how did you survive it?" Her name was Jessica, and her story was heartbreakingly familiar. A husband who'd gradually checked out emotionally, who'd blamed her for his distance, who'd finally left with someone else while making her feel like it was her fault for not being enough. "I feel like I'm dying," she whispered, "like he took everything that mattered and left me with nothing." I looked at this young woman standing in front of me, scared, broken, but still standing, still reaching out, still believing that help might be possible, and saw myself 8 months ago. "He might have left," I said gently, "but you're still standing. That means something." I told her about the coffee shop angel who'd reminded me I still had my soul. I told her about the therapist who'd helped me understand the difference between what happened to me and what it meant about me. I told her about the peace that had grown in soil I'd thought was too broken to support new life. "It doesn't feel like it now," I said, "but losing him might be the beginning of finding yourself. Not because divorce is good, but because surviving it will teach you things about your own strength that you never would have learned otherwise." We exchanged phone numbers, and over the following months, Jessica became part of my informal network of women learning to build lives from the rubble of relationships that hadn't survived. Not a support group exactly, but a constellation of survivors who'd learned to recognize each other's light in the darkness. 6 months later, as I was cleaning out old papers, I found the note I'd written to myself during those first terrible weeks. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." I'd copied Isaiah 43:2 in shaky handwriting during one of my darkest moments, when the verse felt more like wishful thinking than promise. Now, reading it again, I realized the promise had been kept in ways I'd never expected. God had indeed been with me through the waters, not by preventing me from getting wet, but by ensuring I didn't drown. He'd walked with me through the fire, not by keeping me from getting burned, but by making sure the flames didn't consume what mattered most. The verse no longer felt like survival insurance. It felt like strength training. God hadn't promised to make life easy. He'd promised to make me capable of handling whatever life brought. And in the process of learning to handle abandonment, betrayal, financial insecurity, and social shame, I'd discovered reserves of strength I'd never known I possessed. You were never truly alone, not even in the flames. God was preserving what mattered most, and that was your soul. On the 1-year anniversary of finding Mark's note on the kitchen table, I drove to the same park where I'd once prayed, "Thank you for not letting me burn." But this time, my gratitude was more specific, more comprehensive, more amazed by the mysterious ways that loss had become gain. "Thank you," I whispered to the God who'd walked through fire with me, "for not answering my prayers the way I thought you should." If God had prevented Mark from leaving, I never would have learned that I could survive without him. If he'd fixed our marriage instead of letting it end, I never would have discovered who I was when I wasn't performing for someone else's approval. If he'd rescued me from the consequences of Mark's choices, I never would have developed the strength to rescue myself. Thank you for loving me enough to let me become who I was meant to be, even when it hurt. Thank you for the coffee shop angel who reminded me I still had my soul. Thank you for the thrift store girl who reminded me I still had something to give. Thank you for the community dinner that taught me service could heal the server. Thank you for the therapist who helped me untangle what was mine from what belonged to someone else. Thank you for showing me that I didn't need to be chosen by someone else to choose myself, that I didn't need to be seen by someone else to know I was worth seeing, that I didn't need to be loved by someone else to believe I was worthy of love. The voice that once asked, "Why?" now softly said, "Thank you." As I drove home through the evening darkness, I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, terrified, abandoned, convinced that her story was ending in failure and shame. I thought about the woman I was now, scarred but strong, alone but not lonely, broken in some places but whole in all the ways that mattered. The scars were still there. I still had moments of sadness about the future I'd lost, still felt occasional twinges of anger about the cruel way my marriage had ended, still worried sometimes about whether I'd ever trust someone enough to risk love again. But the scars had become part of my beauty rather than evidence of my damage. They told a story of survival, of healing, of a woman who'd walked through fire and emerged with her soul intact. They were proof that I could endure the unendurable, that I could lose almost everything and still have enough to build a life worth living. I was walking forward now, not running from my past or rushing toward my future, but moving at the pace of someone who'd learned to trust the ground beneath her feet. Each step was deliberate, chosen, taken with the confidence of someone who knew she could handle whatever came next. Not because life would be easy from now on, but because I'd learned that I was stronger than whatever life could throw at me. Not because I'd never be hurt again, but because I'd learned that being hurt didn't mean being destroyed. Not because I was perfect or healed or finished with the work of becoming, but because I was myself, fully, authentically, unapologetically myself for the first time in my adult life. And that self, I discovered, was someone worth staying for. That night, as I prepared for sleep in the home I'd created from the ashes of the one I'd lost, I offered one final prayer. Thank you for showing me that some things can't be stolen because they were never given by human hands. Thank you for teaching me that my worth was written into my DNA by the God who knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for proving that love doesn't leave. People leave. But love remains. Thank you for taking what was meant to destroy me and using it to reveal who I really am. Thank you for showing me that the end of one story can be the beginning of a better one. Thank you for teaching me that I am not what happened to me. I am what I chose to become because of what happened to me. And thank you for proving that some treasures are theft-proof. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of presence, thick with peace, rich with the promise that whatever tomorrow brought, I would meet it as a woman who knew her own worth, who trusted her own strength, who believed in her own capacity to create beauty from ashes. A woman who had learned that the most valuable thing she possessed, her soul, could never be stolen because it had never been given by another person. It was hers by divine design, protected by grace, sustained by love that would never leave. And that, I had discovered, was everything. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Romans 8:28. From the woman who sat on her closet floor 8 months ago, holding an abandoned sweater and wondering if God had forgotten her name, to the woman who now knows that some treasures are theft-proof, this has been a journey not just of survival, but of discovery. She learned that losing everything visible doesn't mean losing everything valuable, that being abandoned by someone who promised forever doesn't mean being abandoned by the one who is forever. That the cruelest betrayals can become the doorways to the most beautiful transformations when we stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What now?" What has life tried to steal from you? Your peace, your hope, your sense of worth, your ability to trust, your dreams for the future. And what if God has protected something sacred that you haven't seen yet? What if, like Sarah, you still have your soul, that essential, unbreakable part of you that was never given by another person, so it can never be taken by another person? What if your worth was written into your very being by the God who formed you, who knew you before you drew your first breath, who calls you beloved not because of what you do, but because of who you are? What if the thing that feels like the end of your story is actually just the end of a chapter? What if the loss that broke your heart is the very thing that will teach it to beat stronger? What if the betrayal that shattered your world is clearing space for God to build something better? Let the silence hold you now. Let it remind you that even in the emptiness, you are not empty. Even in the abandonment, you are not alone. Even in the loss, you have not lost everything that matters. Rest in the truth that you are seen, you are known, you are treasured by love that will never leave. Let Isaiah 43:2 become your verse, your promise, your anchor. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Remember that some things can't be stolen. Some things are yours forever. And the most precious thing you possess, your soul, your identity as God's beloved, your capacity to love and be loved, that is theft-proof. When you pass through the waters, He will be with you. When the fire comes, you will not be consumed, because what God places inside you cannot be stolen. You are held by arms that will never let go. You are loved by a heart that will never change its mind about you. You are known by a God who sees not just who you've been, but who you're becoming. Rest now in the quiet certainty that you matter, that your story isn't over, that your pain has purpose, that your healing will help others heal. Sleep in the peace of knowing that tomorrow you will wake up as someone who belongs to love itself, someone whose worth isn't determined by who stays or who goes, but by the one who promises never to leave. Close your eyes and remember, you are not what happened to you. You are who God says you are, and what God says about you can never be stolen. Sweet dreams, beloved. You are safe. You are seen. You are treasured. And some things, the most important things, are theft-proof.